Yes, again, my name is Eduardo Reyes. I have been dealing with climate change negotiations since 2002, almost 20 years. Yes, 20 years. Even though I have been engaged in so many subjects for so many years, I have been I have worked on many different issues. So we have always talked about capacities and challenges that these conferences of the parties, as we call them, are facing realities that are dealing with climate change. And some of them are unknown in many different ways, but we're trying to see how we could overcome the challenges that we have. And there are many things we will discuss in these climate change negotiations. This capacity building, which is related to the first objective, is linked mainly to the sector of forest, the sector of nature-based solutions, to the sector of landscape, whichever way we call it. And just as a summary, that we got an outcome out of the Paris Agreement back in 2015. We are calling it RED Plus, which is reducing emissions from deforestation, from forest degradation, including conservation, including sustainable management of forests, and carbon emissions. So during the whole presentation, probably we'll be talking about RED Plus, which is the one will be related and could be immediately linked to when you guys start talking about about nature-based solution projects, about landscape projects. It is the same change. Anyway, so let's start. As an administrative issue, we'll stop at 8 o'clock for a 10-minute break. Might 8 o'clock, I don't know what time it would be in Africa. I think it's 7 hours ahead of us. So, Lawrence, I would request you to remind us so we have a 10-minute break within 40 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have another 50 minutes with a 10-minute break until the end. So, this is supposed to be a 3-hour session, the first one out of 3. So, let me start. How to understand climate change negotiations within the UNFCCC with the climate change convention process. I would like to present this cartoon because you go to these COPs meetings and you don't know anything, even though that you believe that you are aware of what you're going to do. It is like a cloud of smoke, a cloud of a lot of things, but you don't know what to do if you don't prepare yourself. So the idea is that of the workshop is to share some experiences that are important about how the conventions are structured. So if you have the chance to participate in one of these sessions, I would recommend it. I would recommend you to do different things, and this would allow you to have a better comprehension of how to approach these negotiations. But you should always keep in mind that we shouldn't wait. The COPs that started, we need to do the outcome analysis. And this is very important so that everybody can have a good understanding of how this process is developed. And in the near future, we will always have issues of challenges and new subjects to talk about and to develop. We'll see the context of the UNFCCC, the roles, documentation, technologies, the art of negotiations, progress in climate change. So there are a lot of things we need to cover, and I have divided this these 3 sessions in order to understand how the process is, the convention is structured, so you are aware of different bodies that are part of these conventions. We're going to talk about the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is the most important so far, in my opinion, that we have at this point, and we need to understand it very well. And we'll be focusing in issues that are dealing directly with the forests, and that has to build, from my personal opinion, in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, Article 5, which is the one that deals directly with forests, with RED+, Article 6, which is the one that is dealing with markets, which is related to getting value for the forest, in Article 13, which is the way that we have to report results that are happening in any actions we are taking within the forest. So those are the main goals of this presentation, and also we'll go over more details in the issues related directly to Article 5, which is RED+, probably the last day. Okay, UNFCCC background. So of course, if you don't understand anything, please stop. Please stop, because the idea is that you have the clarity needed to move on within the process, because it's like going from the basis all the way to the more specific issues that you guys will need to understand for the negotiation. So this is very important. So don't hesitate to stop, interrupt, and take the time you need if you have any questions or comments. We have the history. So everything started back in 1988 when the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change was officially established. As you know, this panel, the ICC group, is a group of scientists that got together almost every year, and they start analyzing all the different issues that are linked to climate change, and climate change from the scientific point of view. When we talk about increase of greenhouse gases, how this is affecting the weather, how this is affecting this or that, and so there were this reunion of scientists who gave an initiation to negotiations. So this is important. They started in 1988, and in 1992 we started to experience climate change, and especially the changes provoked by greenhouse gases. So there were 2 objectives, and the first one was the limitation of 2 Celsius degrees, to have this limit of 2 degrees Celsius for the temperature, and this was the IPCC, which is the institution that provides us with all the scientific information that we use as the basis of our negotiations. Then in 1992, countries got together to adopt the UNFCCC, which was a very important step that happened in Brazil 20 years ago. And it was one of the most important steps for humanity in order to start talking about climate change. So we had this convention, maybe the most important in my opinion, and the negotiations started. And we started thinking, what are we going to do? So the first protocol was created, which is the Kyoto Protocol, which was a great step in order to reduce greenhouse gases emissions and to decrease a great percentage of those gases. So many mechanisms were used, and we saw that developing countries were also engaged in the production of those emissions. And the Kyoto Protocol was not adopted officially. And all this happened in 1998. Then in 2009, we all heard about the Copenhagen Accord. And in terms of outcomes, many things were not very clear. And it was also very important in our perspective because it was the first time that officially developing countries were committing to these accords and also to receive $30 million for controlling deforestation. And this was then a very important step. And we started then in 2005, we started to see, and it was the first engagement that we had for this protocol and for developing what was agreed. And we had not received the financing for the implementation of this process. And we had never seen these funds as we had expected it. And this was important. We also had the creation of the Kyoto Protocol, which happened in December 31st. And after that, then we had the Durban Platform, which happened in the second period of the Kyoto Protocol, and it was the only action that we had in this protocol in order to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. Then in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, which was ratified in 2016, and in then 2018, we finally had what we call the Paris Agreement Rulebook. And so far last year, we had the COP25. We had a good success, especially in what has to do with forests. And that happened in 2021 when we started to ratify the Paris Agreement Rulebook. It's a little bit of history, and we continue this year with another COP27. Last year was COP26. This year it would happen in Egypt. This time is in Africa, which is very important that we start to highlight what is important for the African continent in order to start engaging in a good negotiation around questions on climate change. The objective of the INFCCC is to mitigate, to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. We don't want the temperature to increase more than 2 degrees, and as I said last year, we said that we don't want to talk about Celsius degrees, but we don't want the temperature to exceed 1.5 Celsius degrees. And we said that is the ultimate objective. We have some guided principles, equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and respective capabilities. We talk about CBDR and RC principles. And developed countries said that they're not responsible for greenhouse gases emissions. So we want a cooperation, and we share these responsibilities. Most developed countries have different financial challenges that we will talk about later. And we are focused on cooperation, a principle of cooperation, and the way we'll carry out this cooperation will be different according to different factors. We have specific needs, special circumstances of developing countries. We have precautionary measures we have also the principle of cooperation, which is very important. And as I was talking about previously, about this shared capacity, we have some commitments. And all the parties should publish national inventories of greenhouse gas emissions, which is very important. And then developed country parties should do this every 2 years. And for developed countries in 2015, we had an inventory every 4 years. So we had national communications, which is a report presented to the UNFCCC, where we present everything that's happening in the countries, what the actions we're taking, what the expectations are. And that's part of the national reports. And this report is prepared every 4 years. And right now, we'll be preparing it every 2 years. And also we have the importance of these reports, besides all the information that we gather in these reports, is the information about greenhouse gas emissions, because we have the information about the amount of emissions that each country produces, and this would be important to know what to do, what measures, mitigation measures to take. So developed countries parties should adopt national mitigation policies, provide new and additional financial resources for developing countries, assist developing country parties particularly vulnerable to climate change in meeting the costs of adaptation, which is a great discussion, this point. And if you ask me what is the sense of what developed countries will like developing countries to do, they're focusing more in mitigation while most of developing countries are focusing on adaptation and not on mitigation. So this is why this discussion is very important, and which is good is that we are talking about forests and activities at the same time. Activities to stop deforestation and to have reforestation projects, and these are activities for mitigation, indeed. But at the same time, it makes that the countries that are less vulnerable, that has to do with the less vulnerable countries, which is something we need to keep in mind. We need to take all practicable steps to promote, facilitate, and finance the transfer of technology. We need projects of renewable energy, which is one of the most important parts. And we know that we need to develop our own technology as well. And we also know that technology is important for many other subjects. Now we'll talk about the process. So getting prepared for negotiations. Last COP, we see the organizers participating, and we had around 40,000 people, or a bit more, according to an analysis study that was made. And only around 300 people that attended this COP were part of negotiations. So it's important to get ready, to get prepared, and that starts with national coordination. So each country has their own way of having consultancy about their important subjects for the country. They have regional coordination as well, which will be taken to bigger groups to address specific needs of continents. And that's going to allow us to have agreements around those needs. And the idea is that everything is representative in negotiations, but everything starts at a national level. If you have a problem that is very important for you as indigenous populations, it is important that you start this commitment at a national level, and to have comprehensive understanding of national interests and priorities. So it is important to understand what the national priorities are. Maybe it's renewable energy, maybe it's transportation, maybe that's more important, or mitigation actions. Maybe another country is going to think that a priority is adaptation. So we need to understand what the priorities are at a national level to have a good sense of interest of other delegations. That's very important, because as countries, you'll go to these conferences, and you need to get together as groups. And I think the African continent, I think you have great internal consultations within or among all your members, and I think sometimes it could be complicated to get to a consensus. So it is important, because when we have a consultation is a moment where you can participate, and as indigenous peoples you can talk, and you can start promoting and provoking changes according to your priorities, and you would have presenters at the COP, so you should be able to mobilize because this has to do also with financing, and there's a big gap when we talk about financing in the COPs. So there are funds that are for indigenous peoples, and I think that you could receive financing of this kind. There should be a clear division of tasks. You go to the COP, and there are many discussion points in the agendas, but there are also other negotiations that are happening outside those agendas. So there's someone who is leading the team, and maybe we could assign assign roles in our group. Someone who's going to be in charge of finances, etc. So at the end, your leader should be able to commit or in many different subjects, but this person cannot be committed or engaged in all subjects. So that's why it's important to have this sense of group, of a team. We have different information documents, briefing papers that we should have in mind that at the beginning are the basis. Also, we have the introductory statements, and we'll have the chance to talk about it later. But we should be very prepared for before these kinds of big conferences, and that starts at the coordination, at the national coordination. So we need to be aware of the importance of this type of coordination. We need to start with this introductory statements, and among yourselves, you need to be prepared and to ensure that each group and the following, etc., can talk about the same preoccupations, the same concerns, and if we don't have a, a common comprehension, then there won't be a focus on those things we need. And nobody's going to mobilize those needs for us. So we need to establish good connections with the negotiators of other countries. We have the procedures. We have some rules of procedures, and this was not adopted officially, but we always applied, which is very interesting. Is not officially adopted, but we apply it. We talk about consensus versus voting. Maybe you know about it, about the decisions that we make within the COP, which are not through voting, but it's through consensus. Even if each COP should do this, but unfortunately this agenda hasn't moved forward as the parties would have liked. So this consensus versus voting has not been really taken into account. So COP can adopt protocols to promote the implementation of the UNFCCC, which is not legally binding, and it is very important to keep this in mind about the changes that we need to implement, but we need to understand that this is not formally done, except for those related to the Kyoto Protocol and for the Paris Agreement. There are positions that are legally binding and other measures that are not. So This creates different discussions around financing, for example. So that creates tensions between groups that could finance finances and other groups uh, as for legal obligations of developed countries. And we need to see at which point it is necessary to establish specific funds, and as we said, is not formally done, and this provokes different difficulties, but we can adopt protocols, and we need ratification in the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in what happened in 1997, but it was ratified 8 years later. So that took some work, and then the COP adopted some amendments with a 3/4 majority, but I didn't see any amendments that were supported by a consensus. The adoption happens at the end of the COP, which means that the COP should end before midnight on a Friday. But we continue to work during Saturday, the following Saturday, in order to get to a majority in the discussions, in order to be able to adopt amendments, and the president, the chair, will be reviewing those processes within the UNFCCC processes in order to adopt those amendments. So this is a little bit about the procedures that are related to the UNFCCC. Okay, conduct of business, the agenda, adoption of the agenda. Rule 9 of the draft rule procedure. Preparation of the provisional agenda of each session of COP or CMP by the Secretariat in agreement with the President. As we talked about before in the Kyoto Protocol, there should be an agreement with the President, and this should happen 6 weeks before the COP. We have the preparation of a provisional agenda of each session of the subsidiary bodies by the Secretariat in agreement with the chairs of those bodies. So we can say it like this. We have a meeting in June, and by mid-April for the agenda, this agenda should be presented to all the parties in order to know what's going to be discussed. And most SP reunions should be prepared 6 weeks prior. And then the parties are obliged to present the topics that they would like to include in the agenda. This is important that we know, because maybe by the end of this month it would be the deadline for some subjects, and the countries should prepare what they want to present for the following meeting in June. So this is we're going to talk about some subjects in the meeting, but there's a process, there's a protocol for doing this, and you have the right to talk about the subjects you want to talk about in the agenda. Because the idea is that we are all ready, all prepared, and have a clear understanding of what we're going to take into the discussion. And that's the Rule 11. The distribution of the agenda in the 6 official languages of the UN. We have the experience of the last COP. Specifically, it is a topic that was brought up by the African group, and this group brought different subjects related to adaptation and in the special circumstances of African countries about climate change. And I understood that this was not sent within the deadline for the submissions for the agenda, but there was a suspension for different topics of the African group. And so around the COP, it starts always in a Monday. So if we don't have an agreement about the agenda, everything would be in standby until another consultation. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of support for this subject in the African group. And what countries have said is that some subjects have been brought up by the Rule 11, which indicates that all topics of the agenda should be present in before starting the session. And we need to highlight this. If you're going to a COP, there should be a good understanding, a good alignment of topics and priorities. And developing countries have so many interests, so many diverse interests. And we have the group 67 and plus China that that we cannot bring up all the subjects that are important for us, unfortunately. And many topics brought up by the African group haven't been taken into account or they haven't received the support that they needed. And I think right now, and it's my personal opinion, that everybody is affected right now. And why not giving the importance to the African group, giving the African group the same importance as the Asian group, for example? And our delegations are sometimes very small. And sometimes the real negotiations happen, and more than 40,000 people attended the COP, and most negotiations come from developed countries. And this will modify the efficacy of what's going to happen. So we need the capacity, the ability of understand the procedure, the process, and that way we will be able to create a bigger influence on the decisions. Now we're moving to the next slide. All right, now we're talking about quorum, which is very important for the opening of a meeting. At least 1/3 of the parties to the convention or the protocol. If you don't have enough quorum, then the discussion will not be open. And in practice, the president verifies that the representatives of all the negotiating groups are present before opening the negotiation. There is a representative for each topic. For the African group, there are so many groups. We have the OCIS, ABA, and China, and we have many negotiation groups, and the president at the reunion will verify that the representative of each negotiation group is present in the meeting. This will not this will allow every country to express and to add any voices if needed. And then in practice, this is what they do and the way they would manage the quorum. Then we have institutional structure. But first, are there any questions so far? Let me know if you have any questions. Yes, I think that Mariam has a question. Okay, Mariam. Yes. Good evening. Thank you for this presentation about negotiations. And the first question is, a negotiation group can, including the African group, in one country we can have different negotiation groups? And if so, can a group talk about different subjects at the same time? Because Eduardo was saying that when when we have a group, there's a leader who talks about everything, but the leader doesn't have the right to talk about different subjects at the same time. But can't a group talk about many subjects at a COP in general? Thank you. I didn't get it in English. No, I didn't hear it in English. So the question is if we can have many groups in the same country and if we can have different subjects. Yes, of course. You can have any subjects you need that are important for you, and it's important to understand what subjects you need to negotiate on, and that's very important for the African countries, especially for the Congo basin. And you can talk about the perspective of forests in terms of adaptation or the perspective of mitigation. And at the same time, if you think that there's another important subject, you can bring it up as well. and whoever takes the leadership of the group can bring it up. And this person can take all these interests in the group. There was a you need to have a national coordination, because if we you have many topics and the person who will be discussing, if you're not included, you're gonna lose from the beginning. So my recommendation, my suggestion is that all topics are important, obviously, but obviously not all topics are adapted to the meeting. But we need to bring different topics to the discussions. And you'll see in the Paris Agreement, in the second day, we talked about very important topics. But all subjects should be brought up within the national group. Okay, I understood. Thank you very much. You're welcome, Maria. So, institutional structure, we have stages in the treaty making process. A lot of this happens before the adoption of any treaty or any agreement. We have the pre negotiation, which is actually the framing of an issue, and this also applies for Mariam's question, how do we get to a subject? We can do this with a formulation committee. There's a pre-negotiation, there's a formulation of national positions. Then we have initiation of negotiations. Where are we going to negotiate? A subject that I want to bring up in the process. We need to think about the adoption of negotiating mandate, which is also very important, in the negotiations. So we need to start with structural issues, which are committees and coalitions, and because this is related to Mariam's question, this can be applied in your own country. What are the coalitions? You can formulate your positions, and you need to try to find the best place for the negotiation. And then there's the adoption of the mandate, and you will need a representative for this subject. You should have committees in traditional groups, other groups, and then you have the procedures. If these negotiations happen before the adoption of subjects, there should be decision-making rules, transparency, access rules, etc. That's a very important point. Then we have national consentment. That's also very important. We need an agreement, a national agreement. We need. Then we have a signature, ratification, or accession, and we need to verify that all the conditions of the protocol are respected. And then this is going to enter into force. So you see, Miriam, all the different stages at different levels. That takes some time before this enters into force, and from the beginning till the end. So there's a whole process of red tape of adoption. We learned a lot throughout the years to complete negotiations, and here you have the structure of a UNFCCC negotiation session. There are informal consultations, formal consultations, and all this starts with a mandate in a plenary session. There's a plenary with all the countries where they present what they want to discuss, what they want to talk about. If that's going to happen within the COP, there are many political questions, and and you can hear what every country has to say, and what developed countries have to say, and how this is going to be discussed. And this plenary is the beginning of all COPs, because that's the moment where you have the opportunity to present your topics. And that's open to NGOs, and then the participation to those COPs. You also have, for example, forest communities, indigenous communities, and then you present what was agreed by a group. So you can say anything you want, and I like to be very realistic in these COPs. I've had the opportunity to hear about to listen to positions of NGOs and observers, just to see if there's a real impact on negotiations. And I'm going to be honest with you, and none of what has been said by NGOs and observers was taken into account in the places where negotiations were taking place. They were able to transmit the message, but NGOs and observers were not taken into account most of the times, unless there's a negotiator. So it is important that at a national level you can start your negotiations, and that you start your internal process within your countries in order to prepare for negotiations and to understand what your national priorities are. In that way, to see if this would call the attention of the plenary, and what you have to say in behalf of your country, and what you talk about, and what's going to be highlighted in the policies you want to adopt. After the plenary session, at the end of the plenary session, the plenary will decide on the different times and places where the agenda will be negotiated. And this is going to be placed in the contact group. So each point of the agenda, in any specific points in the agenda that the chair of the plenary will assign, you will have a slot of 3 hours to discuss issues of forests, and this would be in private. And whoever start this, this everything starts in the contact group. We will have, for example, from 10 to 1 p.m. and for a discussion. So if you take your topic as NGO as an observer, then the plenary president will give their opinion. But everything goes, all those points that you need to discuss are going to go through the contact group. And you see in the diagram here under informal consultations is not open to NGOs, for example. And now we have another practice where the president asks if there are any problems that need more consultation, and the observers and the NGOs have the opportunity to be a part of those groups. So if everybody agrees, we can continue. And maybe you don't intervene, but you can hear all the different positions of the different parties in order to discuss a specific topic. And there will be a test given by the Secretariat in order to have these discussions. And if everybody agrees, if there are no objections, then we have and then from the informal consultations, we have specific consultations, and this is a very important and complicated part to get to in terms of agreements on a specific subject. So we created meetings called informal informals, which is a very important group that we created. And there are 3 different spin-off groups. Ones that are for drafting. The chair might ask 2 representatives of the country, of the parties, one from Annex 1 or one from another group, to share about the different groups and start working on the drafting groups. But that doesn't stop anyone from attending. When I say anyone is unofficial negotiators, observers, NGOs. They have possibilities to attend. Then there are the friends of the chair in the spin-off groups, which in principle this has been criticized because the chair shouldn't have friends. Every country should be friend of the chair, and you could attend. And of course, you can do some consultations with the specific groups about what happens normally in practice, that there are consulting the different regional groups. And of course, the regional groups representatives would bring all the representatives to discuss the specific issues that are creating some differences between the parties. And of course, there is also a high-level consultation, which the chairs of the COP choose ministers, 2 ministers, one from Annex 1 and one from non-Annex 1 countries, and assign a topic that he would ask them to please do the consultations with the parties. But all this happens at closed doors. When I say this, is not open to observers, not open to NGOs or to any other groups. So if you are not an official negotiator of a country, you cannot participate in these negotiations. And unfortunately, at the spin-off groups, you get the understanding, if any. I'm not saying that nobody get to an agreement, but we can start moving to a informal consultations. Then we move back to the informal consultations, and they move back to the contact group and bring it to attention of the chair. And we say this in the contact group: oh, this is a position, we didn't get to an agreement, or unfortunately we get a common understanding, etc. The chair of the contact group comes to the point where he heard all the points with the support of the Secretariat and takes notes, and that helps to create new negotiation text, about the issue that is being discussed and that will be produced before going into the plenary. Then the process starts again once the new text is produced. You go through another contact group, another informal consultation, another informal informals, and the process starts all over again. It goes into Friday. Friday we have the plenary, and in principle, the plenary is always put on hold. If there are issues that are under discussion, they're put on hold, and they move if they see if they can get to an agreement. An agreement that could be that there's no agreement. So that is the issues of negotiation. So it is important for you to understand these points because you have to pay a lot of attention when all these informal consultations are happening, how to follow them, even though you're not allowed to be in the group when this is officially being discussed. Eduardo, I think there is a question from Parfait. And just for you to know, you can also, if you want to hear this in English, you can change your language. But I can also translate. You have a translation, I think, in a button on your screen. You can choose French or English, but otherwise, okay, parfait. If you want to share your question, over to you. Yes, go ahead. So, good morning. I'm talking from Congo, Brazzaville. We I want to excuse myself. There were some connection problems. I joined after the slide that I'm seeing. Thank you. All right. Thank you for joining us. And in any case, we are recording the presentation, so we'll share it with you from the beginning. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Severin, do you have a question? Yes. I'll speak in French. I feel more comfortable speaking in French. So I had a question. It's about the terminology. I understand what mitigation means, but I would like to know about the difference between adaptation and resilience. Because I have a little confusion between those two terms. And the second question is about the phase that was explained, where the NGOs have the right to participate, and another phase where the NGOs don't have the right to participate. So my question is, for example, NGOs have topics that they chose. If those subjects are not introduced in the first phase where the NGOs can participate, how, if those NGOs didn't have the chance to accept the questions or to talk about their preoccupations, how can they how can they participate in the second phase when they don't have the right? And as for general topics, I think there's a general topic before the negotiation starts, before the countries are in the sessions. I think there's a general topic, and so each country has different preoccupations, different concerns. So those topics, how can we get to a consensus? Because we have the country members of the UN. So if each country has takes their concerns, their topics, how can we get to an agreement, a general agreement? Thank you. That's a good question, Severin. Let me see if I can answer your question. So, as for the first one about adaptation and resilience, so resilience is a, is a very interesting concept. Is like a trend. Everybody's talking about resilience without really knowing what it means. So, in my opinion, it is the capacity of any system or ecosystem, the capacity to recover the stage, the previous stage before an affectation or an anthropogenic impact produced by human action. So it's how an ecosystem recovers itself little by little in order to get to a point. And that means that that ecosystem is already adapted. So is it the step by step before going to the adaptation phase? It's my personal opinion about resilience. And there are ecosystems that are exposed to different threats and impacts that have affected them. So how can we help this ecosystem to face those impacts? So so in other words, how to help this ecosystem to be less vulnerable before they get to that adaptation phase, adaptation to those impacts. And now the subject about the impact, if the greenhouse gases increase, we have the relationship between mitigation, the challenge of mitigation, and adaptation. So resilience comes with how we can help that ecosystem to survive those impacts. So I hope that was clear. So resilience is the step by step process of how to resist impacts before going to the adaptation stage. And as for the discussions, as I said, everything starts right after the COP. So if the COP finishes in November, the following step we is the negotiation. So national coordination is important. We need to know what the national coordination is, what are the subjects, the concerns, the important concerns that we need to discuss that are highlighted, and we need to know to have clarity about these subjects for discussion. And at the end of each COP, we always have the Secretariat, who will announce in the following weeks the deadline to submit the documents, and most of the times that deadline is before the party reunion, the party's reunion, which is a subsidiary meeting. And as I said, if that happens in June, so the Secretariat needs to have the agenda for the discussion. So 6 weeks, it will be in April, and the Secretariat will ask the countries to present their points of view, their documents about very specific subjects they want to discuss in the following sessions. So in most cases, the date would be March 31st to present this document with all the questions and the subjects, and you can find this information in the Secretariat's website, and you would have access to all that information. So from that perspective, the agenda needs to be prepared. So if you lose that chance, if from an NGO perspective, you need to talk to your national coordinator, and they would have another deadline, for example, January, because it's then when we start other processes. So we need to be ready in January, for example. But if you miss that date, it's important to know you have to engage yourselves officially so that your subjects, your concerns are mentioned in the reunion. So it is difficult that your specific concerns are treated if you don't bring it up from the beginning. And that's why I said January, February, talk to your national coordinator, which is the person who will be in charge. The person who is in charge of that area. That happens with also the Minister of Environment or national or international national affairs. So we need to know who is coordinating that process. Otherwise, you would need to wait until the next process. So we finish in June, and then that same month we would have non-official conclusions. But maybe there we would have an opportunity. You would have an opportunity to resend your new suggestions. So we need to know who is coordinating that process and what that commitment looks like, so we can assure that your agenda will be talked about, will be taken into account. And as I said, the countries have the right to talk about any concerns. And during the COP, before everything starts, and as I said, for example, the African group, before everything started in Glasgow, there was a discussion, a plenary discussion, and we were talking about if we were include this or this subject, this or this concern, and we realized that we didn't have official adoption measures, and we used Article 11 before the meeting started. So we would take at least 6 weeks. We talked about it, about what was necessary in order to include different subjects in the agenda. For the agenda that was going to be accepted. As for the recommendations, we need to start early in January, reviewing everything we need to do. We need to review this immediately, everything that is necessary at the national level, and start from there. So I hope I answered your question. All right, I understood. Thank you. So we're going to take a little break. Laurence, can we take a little break right now? Yes, we can have a 10-minute break and we come back at 8:37. Hi, Eduardo. I think we can come back to the presentation. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, just to follow up what we were discussing, this is an example of a day of negotiation from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. We have There's a space for country delegation meetings, country groups contribution, coordination meetings. It is most likely that you will belong to one group meeting, and that will attend from 7 to 10 a.m. Some different We'll have different groups that happens every day. Then from 10 to 1 p.m. there's an official UN meeting time. You have plenaries, working group meetings, contact group meetings that happens between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. From 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. again we have country group coordination meetings. We have informal consultations. Remember all the different scenarios. We also have lunch. Sometimes you have your lunch at the same time that you're attending one meeting. You will probably skip lunch if the issues you're discussing are important. Also, there are side events organized by the Secretariat, by parties or observers or NGOs. Press conferences by the Secretariat, parties or observers that happens between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then from 3 to 6 you have official UN meeting time. Most official UN meeting times happen from 10 to 1 and from 3 to 6 p.m. We have official negotiations that are happening. That doesn't stop that the chair of any agenda item decide that you could have an extra time to meet again and continue the negotiation that has been requested, if that has been requested by the parties to the Secretariat after 6 p.m., and the Secretariat would see if they could find a room, because remember, there we have a big agenda for discussions, and all these rooms, then the room capacity, they need to see if the room capacity is available, because it's normally limited. The Secretariat has to struggle to find additional rooms. So those are the official times, and after 6 p.m. to 8, we have country group coordination meetings, and sometimes it happens that a negotiator of a group would do a little part, and then they would have a coordination meeting after 6 p.m. So starting at 6 p.m., parties normally encourage further discussion. That happens, and sometimes they would ask immediately to stop the meeting. And if the president has another meeting, he would stop the meeting, and that's part of the procedure that needs to be followed. And sometimes the president can have press conferences or other meetings, and after 6 p.m., the parties should agree for continuing meetings. And then, and this could be an informal meeting, a consultation meeting. So it's not an official negotiation meeting, but after 6 p.m., everything has to be coordinated with the parties themselves. And that's an example of a negotiation day. Then we also have the week overview. You have a lot of preparation. We have preparatory country group meetings, and it could happen that groups can start meetings on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. There are groups that start on Friday, and different groups like China start on Friday, and everything starts before the COP starts, where we have the contact groups in order to inform yourselves, and then Wednesday, this happens in the corridors. There are informal or formal meetings. There is a participation of different groups, and it's a way, a non-official way of approaching all the groups and express your thoughts about your concerns and present your subjects for negotiation. There are also consultations of high level done by ministers, and they would talk on about topics that have been decided by the COP's president for developing or developed countries, in order to ask for the subjects that will be in the discussions on Friday, which is the closing plenary. the institutional structure. Okay. So the institutional structure of conventions, we have the supreme governing bodies, and it's also a conference of the parties in the. So we have parties that get together. Those are the supreme governing bodies, and those are the highest decision makers responsible of the implementation of the convention and of the all legal instruments in order to promote the implementation of the meeting and the power to make within the mandate the decisions necessary to promote the effective implementation of the convention. And we also have the CMP, the Conference of the Parties, where we have the agreement of the parties, where everybody discuss about the parties' agreement. Then we have the subsidiary bodies. We have two main working bodies within the UNFCCC. We have the SBSTA. We have which provides the COP and the CMP and any other subsidiary bodies with timely information and advice on specific and technological matters related to the convention and the Kyoto Protocol. So they'll be talking about subjects on the positions that need more information, more scientific information and technological information. They work in a specific place to discuss about many topics, as far as I understand, about different protocols. We have the SBI, which assists the COP, and the CMP in the assessment and review of the implementation of the convention, and the Kyoto Protocol, which started in 2020, 2021, and then we have the different working groups and committees. For example, the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action under the convention, which is a very important one, and we also need to follow these discussions and to know what the progresses are, and we need to find where your subjects are going to be discussed in, where that would take place. And we have another group and many documents that are produced by this working group. So we need to be sure, as I mentioned before, that your team is following a topic here, another topic over there, and we need to see what the position that you want to take is, and ensure that this is included, that what you need to be included is included in the COP. So everything's important: the COP, the CNP. Then we have the Bureau, which is composed of the president, 7 vice presidents, the chairs of the SBSTA and the SBI, and the rapporteur, which need to submit the documents and provide advice and guidance to the president throughout the sessions. This acts as a secretariat, and whoever they decide is going to be part of the COP, who's going to present the decisions of the party, and this is a very important body so that everybody knows everything. So we need access to the president, to vice president of the COP. And then we have the Secretariat that acts like the Bureau and the subsidiary bodies. This assist parties in the implementation of the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. And they are the ones responsible of the preparation of official documents of COPs before the beginning of the COP. And you might remember, as I said, when discussions finish about emissions of a specific agenda. So you need to ask the Secretariat, ask them to produce a document for the day after in order to have a document ready at 10 a.m. when the negotiations start. I'm not saying that this is always going to be ready at 10 a.m., but everybody expects this to have the discussion at that time. And it's one of the main responsibilities of the Secretariat, the coordination of exams and national communications, of text, and the inventory, all the data, and all the national communications sent by each country. So they need to gather all these documents and then transfer this information to the parties, to the stakeholders, and present and organize meetings and workshops according to the parties' needs. It could happen that the parties agree that if they have to follow a point in the agenda, if this deserves a workshop that could be included in a specific agenda before the following meeting of the party. This is an example of a negotiating forum, this is the plenary in Bonn. This is a forum for the decision making of the parties. This is open for participation of all parties, observers, states and organizations, the media, and other participants registered for the session. You cannot participate officially, and when I say officially, if you're representing any NGO, you need to be sure that your NGO is officially registered or recognized by the convention. If it's not recognized, you cannot participate. It's not a place for negotiation, it's just a place to do statements, whatever the statement is, by the parties, by NGOs, observers. They would do the same. It's at the plenary. And they would talk about this is the place where the COP starts, and this could happen between in the first week of negotiation. So the countries get together. We have the contact groups. Then you remember we had the plenary session. We have the contact groups through the COP, the CMP, the SB decision to conduct negotiations on specific agenda items. We have the creation based on a proposal by the president, chair of the subsidiary body or a party. And this contact group is very important, especially the observers and the participants can speak, can send a message, a more specific message about a specific agenda. And they're going to talk about this, about the date, place, are announced in advance. And they would announce if there's a meeting from 10 to 11 or 10 to 1 in a specific room for the negotiations. Then we have the informal consultations from the contact groups. Now we move into the informal consultations. And it's there where the official part starts. So it depends on the subject that is going to be treated. This is convened by the president or chair of a subsidiary group, subsidiary body or contact group, and there's an invitation of a delegate by the presiding officer to undertake consultations on a particular issue. And it's the first time that the parties are committed in highlighting the key aspects or the key concerns. And this is the informal consultation. In these informal negotiations, we talk about it with the group participation, and we choose who is going to present specific topics. And in that point, the observers cannot participate unless the president allows it, or allows them, or allows NGOs to participate. So the president will decide if they have the permission to enter and participate. And then in the informals, sometimes it's complicated to have NGOs as observers. Here we have more bilateral or multilateral meetings. Where we have discussion source of specific problematic issues, or if we're advancing in negotiations or contentious issues. And for this informals, we also have groups. We have a picture of the type of meetings. You see the groups are getting smaller. Sometimes we can have 3 or 4 small meetings at the same time. And you can choose which group you want to join. Sometimes there are many people, as you can see on the right. Just a second. I think, Eduardo, you can follow the presentation. Yeah, but it doesn't move forward. Maybe try to escape from the presentation and to go back. It doesn't respond to escape. That's what I'm trying to do. Okay. Okay, I get it. Yes. So again, here we can see all the types of meetings which can take place during the session. So as you can see, we have many arrows which show the connections between meetings. And at the end, we should follow as groups to follow the connection between meetings since they're all connected. So we need to understand that your specific subject that you want to discuss is connected to another subject that someone else is talking about in another meeting, in another agenda. Then we have the negotiation issue, which is linked to the question or to the issue that we talked about a few minutes ago. So the beginning of the work by the COP or the CMP or the SBI, SBSTA. So the issue is put on the agenda. So you suggest your issue, your concern. And then we have the discussion and negotiations on the issue. This starts. And between the beginning of the discussion of the challenge, there are internal discussions at the national level. This is done by different parties, observers, NGOs, who would present their point of view of on a specific subject. And we're talking about when we present this document, I always say that the deadline is March 31st. So you need to be ready and send the document to the Secretary before March 31st. So you need to communicate with your national coordinator, and you need to know that the work starts with the negotiation phase, the internal negotiation phase, the preparation of documents to support the negotiation. This is done with the Secretariat. And most of these discussions happen in regional groups. And we prepare the conclusions and the decisions. That will be discussed in the meeting, and then we have the agreement of the parties. That doesn't happen too fast. That we need to remember that. And then there's an implementation of decisions. We have conclusions of the issue, and this is not prepared by the parties, but you implement what has been adopted, and the UNFCCC would implement what you decided on. Because maybe if the decision that we adopted when we translate it into the implementation process, and I remember a personal process a few years ago when we finished. I wasn't sure about what we had agreed on and what we were going to implement, and then I started to see every detail of the negotiation of the text. I started seeing how we could move forward with the implementation of the activity in question. So it is important to really understand that the times, and if we're not part of the process, we cannot understand what's behind the process, and we could get lost. So that's why we have experts who can help us at a technical level when we talk about negotiations. And so we need to be prepared and to really have clarity on what we're doing. So this is the general process that we need to keep in mind. So, so are there any questions so far? Because we'll keep going talking about actors. So before that, are there any questions? Okay, types of actors. We have groups of states, observers, conference officers, and facilitators, and the Secretariat. All the different actors involved, and each one of them have different people. Obviously, we have negotiating groups and coalitions. But very, very important. It's important to understand these groups. We have 5 UN groups. We have African states, Asian states, Eastern European states, Latin American, and the Caribbean states, as well as Western European and other states. We also have the G77 plus China, which is composed by different developed countries and also developing countries, where we can find the African Group, the Alliance of Small Island States, the OPEC countries, the least developed countries. We have ALBA, ILAC, we have BASIC, LMDCs, etc. We also have this G77 plus China, has different groups, as you can see. And obviously, consensus can be a little bit difficult to achieve, since there are many different national circumstances and contexts, different topics. And that's why we have meetings prior the events in order to coordinate the whole process, and that's why we have meetings during the day. We have around 3 or more meetings during the day. Since there are very big groups, we have the European Union, which has 27 member states. We have an umbrella group, which has Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the United States, which is a very strong group. Then we have the Environmental Integrity Group. We have Mexico, South Korea, Switzerland, and Monaco. And finally, we have Turkey. So we see this negotiation groups and coalitions. And obviously, we'll talk about forests here. And normally, that has to do with the environmental integrity, but it doesn't mean that other groups For example, small islands cannot talk about these issues. And that group should have a consensus with the African group. And also, they talk about specific agendas, and that's the same thing when we talk about the importance of having this clarity when we talk about different subjects. So we insist on this national coordination, or this coordination around forests, which has to be coordinated with other groups when we discuss different concerns. And then here we have all the negotiating groups. And as I said, we have small island developed states, the G77 in China, which is a big group. We have many developing countries there. And then in green, you see the countries that are part of coalitions for forest nations. There are two kinds of green. One of them represent countries that are now fighting for more actively. And you can see the complexity of these negotiating groups, and you are part of a group, but at the same time you are part of another group, and maybe that second group has different interests. So you need to get to a consensus. And when there is not no consensus, and there's not an official position, normally that could happen. Unfortunately, that could happen. And we see the importance of forests, but the way of talking about those challenges is different depending on each group, each country, and we have different circumstances. So we see the groups, we have regional and interest groups negotiating blocks. So obviously, together is better than membership in one group does not preclude membership in other groups. We it has to do with national priorities of circumstances, specific context, as well as decision of each countries. We have ad hoc coalitions, we have inclusiveness and transparency, pre-session preparation and workshop. We need a mailing list and communication, which is important, and also regional versus coalitions within multilateral environmental agreements. So the question is, when we're presenting a position by observers and NGOs, we need to identify which which group negotiating block is better to consider your concern. That could happen in a coalition. Maybe when you have to participate in different sessions or pre-session workshops in order to be up to date with what is happening. So that's important as well. It's important that you know when these groups are having meetings and everything that's happening, because it's there where you will be talking about your concerns. So you can take these concerns to those groups or coalitions. Then we have the G77 plus China, all known Annex 1 parties. And today we have 134 members, and that changes every year. It was created in 1964. It was a negotiation group that was very strong, and it was formal. And another regional group was also pretty large. Someone asked me a question in a meeting previously about which country wasn't a part of the system of the UN. It's Palestine, which is not a part of the system, but it is a very strong group, and the idea is to have a common position for discussion, regardless of the subject. So forests are important, yes, and we talk about it in the G77. And something else is to see how we can get to an agreement around the subject of forests, for example. Then we have the African Group of Negotiators, or the AGN, which has 54 states from the African continent. And as we know, this is a very diversified group. We have the LDCs, the OPEC countries, South Africa, we have the Arab countries, and we have the priorities such as poverty, lack of resources, vulnerability to extreme events, and those are some of the main challenges for the African group. And it is important that among yourselves that you have a comprehension of the importance of these subjects. And as I said, the COP will take place in Egypt, COP27. So it is important, very important for this country, obviously. And it's also very important for the African continent. And I understand that there are discussions that are being developed at the moment in the African continent that are linked to those concerns that we're going to take to the COP27. And those are issues that were not treated in COP26, maybe. So we need to think of the priorities of the African continent. Then we have the LDCs, or the least developed countries. We have 48 countries, 34 in Africa and 13 in Asia and 1 in the Caribbean. They also have their own priorities. So we see 34 of those countries are in Africa, so it's important to understand because those countries have their own agenda, their own needs. Then you have other LDCs, the PMA, they're considered as the least developed countries in the world by the United Nations. There are some criteria. We have the population cannot exceed 75 million people. They are extremely vulnerable, sensitive to the topic of adaptation, loss, and damage, as well as finance. And they're under the attention of developed countries. And last year, when African countries had their discussion around their agenda, we highlighted the vulnerability of the African continent. And it was obviously important because there are 34 countries, African countries, in this LDC's group. Then we have small island developing states that we mentioned. There are 51 small islands in low-lying coastal states. We have the rising of the sea level, which is a factor of vulnerability in these states. So these countries have to undergo the effects of the sea level rise. So this is a very important group as well. Due to their vulnerability, they have a lot of development challenges, small populations, lack of resources, remoteness, and susceptibility to natural disasters. They're also 5% of the population, global population, so they're also very important. So we also see the role of Belize in the Alliance for Small Island States. We have the ad hoc lobbying and negotiating group for the SIDS members. And this was established in 1990 to deal with climate change issues. And we saw that the position of these countries is very important in the negotiation process. And Belize, for the Alliance of Small Island States, expressed disappointment regarding inadequate actions and urged COP25 to trigger a decade of ambition. So she called for Article 6 to go beyond offsetting and for reforming the climate finance landscape, including to address loss and damage. This happened before COP25. So this is a very strong group. Now we have the European Union group, which has 27 member states of the European Union. They have a common position during international negotiations. It's a very strong group since when they present their position, so it's difficult to change their position once they've expressed it. And most of them are developed countries. And we try to negotiate, but always at different levels and different strategies. We can call them strategies. So at a negotiation level, they're not going to change their positions. When we talk about spinning groups or bilateral groups, so it's the moment where the leader of your delegation can meet up with the leader of negotiations about a specific topic, and then you can start a negotiation of high level. So in terms of strategy, since they have the mandate, it's very important to take into account. They present the questions or the topics with a different perspective, obviously defending their positions, and sometimes non-negotiators, they don't have the right information, the right tools to have a debate that could persuade them to change their positions. So we need to take this to a higher level discussions with ministers. So we need to take this to a higher level of discussion, and that way you will be able to get to an agreement, and that way you you'll be able to see who at a higher level, a president, a minister, and as I said before, everything starts right after the COP. If you don't understand your own position, your own national position, you need to be very sure that this could call the attention that it needs in the national context. Having a president, a minister that at the end of the whole story can can be a part in the discussion, in the negotiation. And if the negotiation is not understood at a higher level, you need to find the person who is going to have the discussion at a even higher level. And this is also very important to understand because it's a very crucial tool, and that's why we we ask about your groups, your positions, in order to be able to have a similar discussion level with stronger groups. Then we have the umbrella group, which has generally 9 members. They're normally skeptical about the Kyoto Protocol and multilateral process. And the Kyoto Protocol, which took place in Japan, changed policies later on, and the positions of countries change as well. Then that's why we have like minded developing countries, which is a coalition of 25 states. We have Arabia, Latin America, in the Caribbean, African, and Asian states. This was established right before the Paris Agreement, and there are other countries involved which are part of it. Also, having in common the issue of forests, and they're all part of the global south. And they represent much half of the world population, so they're a very strong group. And their goal is to create uniformity within the G77 plus China. And we try to find this consensus with the G77 plus China. And they can be a part of other groups at the same time. We have a group called BASIC, which is a group of 4 emerging economies and regional economical powers. We have Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, which is a very strong group. And for many, this is a group of many developing countries which have a very strong voice, which can negotiate with developed countries. And one of the objectives is to have consensus with G77 plus China. And obviously, other countries, other developing countries, sometimes don't agree that their decisions, they would like the decision to be made by themselves and to be a part of this discussion. But there are also a group of the countries who produce more greenhouse gases emissions. And they defend their economic interests. Then we have the ALBA group, which originally was an economic, political, and social organization to promote cooperation between Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a global alliance in negotiations since 2010, and it has 11 members, which is a very interesting group. There's no presidency, and the instauration of a court of justice to prosecute states, companies, and individuals who contribute to the degradation of the environment is a part of this group, among other interests. For example, we have Bolivia, Nicaragua, Dominica, Ecuador, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, and other states. And there are other interests in this group, in this ALBA group. They start to make their voices, to have louder voices in these negotiations. Then we have the ILAC Group, which is the Independent Association of Latin America and the Caribbean, which was formed in 2012. It has 8 members: Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Paraguay, and Peru. And their objective is coordinate ambitious positions during multilateral negotiations on climate change, to have a coherent vision for sustainable development responsible for both the environment and the future generations. It is close to the G77 plus China group. This is a very interesting group, and they have been raising their voices, especially regarding their interests that they have in common with the African group. This is another group that we need to pay attention to. Sometimes it's difficult to get to an agreement, and when there's no consensus, for example, in the previous COP, I remember that they had certain positions that I would say were not supported by coalitions and by the rainforest groups, and the vision that forests could receive the attention that they need, that they deserve, especially financially, that the ILA group had the same position. And personally, I had the discussion with the Panama delegation and their negotiators. And that group didn't agree with the expectations of Panama and the interests of Panama, and then by the end agreed in the way I presented the subjects, and they broke this ILAC consensus. And that's the opinion of Panama negotiators. And those are important topics for negotiators in this convention. since it's not very clear about what happens internally in the countries. Sometimes there are in the country delegations and we have to explain them if there's the disposition of a country so that their position doesn't affect the reality. And sometimes the country actively listens to what the minister or the president has to say. I apologize, his sound is not very clear. There's no doubt of the importance of this group, and the issue was regarding forests. The ILEC was not supported, and in when you and your national group, when we talk about Panama, they highlighted different issues, and these are the points you need to be sure they discuss. But anyway, this is the ILEC group. Then we have the Arab group, countries economically heavily relying on fossil energy. There's an issue that I want to highlight with the Arab group that affects the outcome of Glasgow in the Article 6 of negotiations, which is the article that builds on different issues of different markets. And here we have to do with emissions avoidance. And this discussion is going to take place. And on one side, this group supported the use of fossil energy. And on the other side, they were talking about extraction and how this contributed to emissions of greenhouse gases. And so this is a conservation issue that we see here versus the use of fossil fuels. And so we need to talk separately, and then at the end we need to negotiate this year and see what the different concepts and positions are. And this is a very strong position that this Arab group has. This is part of the African group as well. And now we have the Environmental Integrity Group, which is a coalition of 5 OECD states. We have Mexico, Liechtenstein, Monaco, the Republic of Korea, and Switzerland. They're not part of the EU and they're not aligned with the umbrella group. We're having some trouble with the audio. We see all the different groups. We remember the previous slide where we have all the groups and the countries in green, but those green countries represent the Coalition for Rainforest Nations that was created in 2005. And the idea was to mobilize financial and technological support to reduce deforestation and forest degradation. In 2005, and why is that? When we had the Kyoto Protocol, we had the problem that conservation issues were not part of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol talked about reforestation with some conditions, because those activities only were created with temporarily with certifications, because most of the times when we have a deforestation project, we expect to cut trees for a specific time. So everything that has to do with the reforestation is that certified reduction certification. And when the project decides to cut the trees, they have to replace those trees with something else. So it didn't progress too much. We didn't have many projects on this, and that's why the Coalition for Rainforest Nations initially was reviewing emissions from deforestation through RED+, and then we had discussions about on-conservations and interesting points on conservation that were brought up by India and Costa Rica. They believe in conservation, and they brought this up, and that was accepted when talking about forest management and forestation. And we should remember that when I was talking about the ALPA group, Costa Rica, Colombia, Panama, etc., they said that they were sending the message conservation was not considered. But Costa Rica was one of the countries who brought up conservation into the discussion with RED+. So conservation was included in different groups, and we see how countries change their position and their interests. So this is a country that I would play that will pay attention to forests. The countries or the group that would pay attention to forests will be this one. I also provide services for this organization, especially advising some of the members on how to align their strategies, that they need to understand what RED+ mechanisms are when they talk about their priorities. So I help them to find strategies, etc. Then we have the ABU group. So we have another important group. It was a group created not so long ago, where we have Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. We have very important Latin American countries. And I think when we create these groups, we are part of the G77 plus China group. But within that African group, we have another group. And so we have the opportunity to talk about many topics. So we take a subject, we take it to the G77 group, then we take it to the African group, and then we take it to into a sub-African group in order to talk about different priorities. And we must say that the African countries organize themselves beautifully. We have very nice organization in those groups. And it doesn't mean that sometimes I don't agree with suggest, but that's something we'll discuss later. And I see that the way in which you get together and try to understand the subjects that will be taken to the negotiations is very positive. Then we have different delegations. It always depends on the amount of delegates who would participate in all the different meetings. I want to cover up to here. We're only going to cover until this part. Laurence. Now I want to make sure that the groups are understanding how the system works and how it operates. So there are a lot of meetings, a lot of things happening before going to the COPs. Unfortunately, I always hear, yes, there are many groups organizing, and we have the COP in November, and we start organizing ourselves in September, but that's impossible. You need to start way earlier. In January, you start finding out what's happening and who is attending the COP, and you start introducing your points, highlighting your ideas about this, about that, or any topic that you want to bring up. If forests are important for this group, you would include it into your priorities, and then you would try to accommodate the forest issue. And as a personal experience, I used to be a deputy minister in Panama in a group. In that time, we were discussing issues of Red Plus and the indigenous peoples were participating at these COPs. And I can't remember what the official position was, but they had a position that, in my personal view, when I was listening to them, they were defending forests from a different perspectives, but it was very hard for me to understand. So when I came back from those negotiations, I traveled around the different indigenous communities. I talked to the leaders, and I want to be sure that they were understanding what the indigenous groups were saying, because it wasn't clear for me. And honestly, in my personal perspective at that time, I didn't see the clarity of the subjects for indigenous people, and the reality, they didn't have an idea of what was happening. Some of them were not aware of the discussions, and I just highlighted some of the points, and they claimed that that was what was happening without the leaders of different communities. I don't think they were understanding the topics. And that was a very interesting exercise because we created a group to present some of these capacity building processes for these negotiations about issues that we were talking about. Sorry, Eduardo. We have a question from Parfait. So, Parfait, you, the floor is yours for your question. Your microphone is silent. I was asking if I can. Your microphone is silent again. So thank you, Laurence. Thank you for the presentation. And I have a little concern. In the previous slides about the coalition for Rainforest Nations, maybe you could go back to that slide. Because when we see the representation of countries, when we see the representation of countries, for example, we have the Congo. So we see Congo. Yeah, that's the one. So you see, you know that we have two Congos, the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Brazzaville Congo. So here, what Congo are we talking about? Because the two Congos are Red Plus countries, but for us, we don't have financing from rainforest. So here you're talking about RDC. From you're talking about DRC, and you present it as if it were the other Congo, the Brazzaville Congo. Thank you. Thank you for the comment. And as you can see here, there are 52 rainforest nations in this coalition. I didn't I didn't put all the 52 countries. I just wrote a few examples. I have been in the Democratic Republic of Congo and many times, and it's been very interesting. And DRC, RDC is part of this coalition, in fact. So I could add as well the Brazzaville Congo. I didn't write all 52 countries in this list, and you saw before the countries that are part of the Rainforest Nations coalition, and then they're in all of them are included. So don't worry, we'll include all of them in the list. They're already included in the list. And when I was talking about the anecdotes, I was talking about, I don't know if I answered your question, Parfait. Thank you. And Eduardo, the problem is when we talk about the coalition of rainforest nations, I'm a manager of Red Plus for Indigenous Peoples of Congo. But we don't have a relationship, we don't have a link, we don't feel the implication or the contribution of rainforests in Congo Brazzaville, but in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is support. So that's why when I say when we talk about the coalition, when we say Congo, you're talking about the DRC, right? Because we don't see the mandate of Rainforest Nation in the Brazzaville Congo. If Brazzaville Congo is member of the coalition, I think we need more links to see what sector they're talking about. Thank you. So I just wanted to specify that this Rainforest Coalition has 52 countries, and it was created to discuss in this process of challenges for rainforests. And the idea is to promote management activities for forests And we need to remember that this is a fight that we still have as organizations when we talk about financing. And we need to remember that since the Copenhagen Accord, one of the results, one of the outcomes was that that developed countries would give around $30 billion. And we said that the implementation was so fast that we didn't even see it. So obviously the impact is not done. We continue this fight for financing, and in the DRC et l'autre et Congo fait pas, and the other Congo is a part of this group, and we can present the different challenges. In this group, and that's what we're trying to help to promote. And what is also important in these discussions is to be organized and to be able to have different discussions from different groups, and also we need to talk about the procedures to guarantee access to different groups in order to get to agreements, get to consensus. We know it's not enough. Yes, it's not enough, but we continue this process. We have also tried to work with the private sector in these actions and initiatives, and so that some more initiatives can be taken into account, more national, more local initiatives. This is the fight. This is the negotiation uh, process that we're working on. There's the sound is very weak. We're not able to hear the speaker. I think we cannot hear you very well, Eduardo. There must be some issues with the connection. Let me just check something. As for Eduardo's response, thank you for your answer. Okay, so what I was highlighting is that when I came back from Panama, when I was telling you about this anecdote, and that when I was hearing this, listening to this indigenous leaders, I did a little tour on the different communities, and apparently they were not very aware of all the steps, the stages that they had to go through in the process. So immediately, as a part of our government strategy, we created groups for capacity building for the following COP, which happened in Poland. And some of the leaders were part of the meetings, and so we created a strategy for to ensure that the concerns of indigenous peoples were going to be officially reflected on the decision making process, and that corresponded with the reality and their particular circumstances of their communities. And one of the reasons why we had the Cancun agreements in 2010 is because we brought indigenous leaders as a part of the negotiation groups, and they raised a few points and they raised their voice about their positions, and we created like a leader or over two or three of them, and everybody wanted to have side events with these people. It was a marathonic session since early in the morning, and that was reflected in the outcomes of the COP. And that's why were able to put indigenous people's concerns, and that I just wanted to highlight this in the remaining minutes to talk about this past experience that I had, which I think is very important. I think Parfait has another question. Are there any more questions?